Slovensko. Som profesor američani, angličtiny u Majlandu, blizu Washington, D.C. I'm going to stop right now. So, no, I'm so happy to be back in Slovenia. I was here in 1987, 88 when I had...
When we were students.
As students.
Ages ago.
When you were still Yugoslavia. I was here again in 1994 to 95, when you were newly independent Slovenia, and I have many, many close friends here. It's my favorite place. We also, as you perhaps have heard, we have an exchange program with Ljubljana, which I set up in memory of my oldest son. He went to Bežigrad when he was here. He died 18 years ago, very, very, very sad. But we set up this exchange program with, every semester we've had a Slovenian student living with us, and that's been very, very special. And of course, we have also sent students from our college over here. So. It's wonderful to keep that bond going. So I'm going to, I keep on changing the name of this talk, which is also the name of the book that I'm writing, but I can't decide on the name of the book, so I'll explain that in just a moment. But in the lecture tonight, I'm going to be rather formal for the first half, or the first part of the lecture, because I have a lot to go through. And so that'll be more formal. Then for the second part of the lecture, I will get a little bit more informal and ask you to think of some ideas. You'll see what's going on. I will also, in case there's something you miss or a name I give that I go too fast through, I have a blog. It's called Better Living Through Beowulf. BetterLivingThroughBeowulf.com. Back in the 1950s, we used to say better living through chemistry or better living through General Electric. So this is betterlivingthroughbeowulf.com. So I will post this talk tonight on the blog tomorrow. So you can, if you just want to listen, you can read it. It'll be pretty much very similar. So, anyway, this is my life's work. All my life, I've been exploring how literature changes the lives of readers. As you will see, many theorists have had very strong opinions on this matter over the years, going back at least as far as Plato. And I'm going to do a quick survey of what people have said. So that will be the first part of this talk. For the second part, I'm going to describe how you can examine your own responses to literature and to determine the impact that books have had upon you. You may not feel as though you are a part of history as you read a book, but literature is always read or watched or listened to, one book or one poem or one play at a time. So when Plato worried about young men being corrupted by Homer, he thought that they would see scenes of hell and it would be so frightening that they would turn cowardly on the battlefield. Or he thought that these wonderful eating scenes which you have in the Odyssey, he would make young men lose discipline and want to go out and party. He was talking about people like you, right? When Shelley, Percy Shelley, the great romantic poet, talks about poets helping to end slavery or to liberate women, he sees the process starting when someone picks up a book and starts reading. So, anyway, so there are two parts of this talk. The conversation about poets changing history, and second, how you yourself as readers are part of this changing history. Okay. So first, what do I mean by poetry? So over the ages, people have defined poets and poetry in many different ways. Shelley included even scientists like Sir Francis Bacon. He called him a poet. He called Herodotus a poet. He called... but for the purposes of this talk, when I say poets, I'm really only meaning people who write poetry, people who write fiction, and people who write plays. And what I'm interested in is the way when you get immersed into a work of literature, when you're reading a novel and you get lost in it, when you are reading a poem and you feel like you are taken out of yourself, I'm interested in that particular phenomenon. This aspect of literature which takes you out of this world and puts you in another world. So when I talk about poetry, I'm interested in that aspect of poetry. Okay? All right. Unacknowledged legislators. This is the famous last sentence, or from the famous last sentence of Percy Shelley's defense of poetry. And what he said is that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Basically, he says poets change history, but nobody acknowledges that they do so. Let me read you. This is a little bit of a complex thing that he wrote, but he said poets are the hierophants, that's a hard word, and it's like interpreters of sacred mysteries. So he said poets are think of priests or maybe prophets. So poets are the prophets, poets are the hierophants of an unapprehended inspiration, the mirrors of the gigantic shadows which futurity casts upon the present. So he says that the future casts its shadow on the present, and poets sense this future and take this future and they put it into their works and they give it back to us. And so when we read poetry, plays, fiction by a really great author, we sense what the future is going to be. And it shapes not only our knowledge, but it also shapes how we behave, he says. And it changes our behavior. All right, now I'm going to start going very fast through a whole bunch of people. So we'll start with Plato. Okay, you've all heard of Plato. Plato wanted to keep poets out of his ideal republic because he thought they would arouse passions that would disrupt this philosopher's paradise. At one point in the work, The Ion, he wrote a work called The Ion. He compares poets and also to people who are inspired by poetry to mad dancers, revelers followers of Dionysus. And you can't expect reasonable discourse from those kind of people. He thought those people would blow up his republic, and so he said, no poets in my ideal society. Okay? Aristotle. Okay, Aristotle doesn't agree with Plato here. Aristotle, at least Aristotle didn't think that poetry was negative. He was very positive about poetry. But he does agree that people are really attracted by imitation. I got a quotation from him. He said, man is the most imitative of living creatures, and through imitations learns his earliest lessons. No less universal is the pleasure felt in things imitated. So Aristotle said we're absolutely drawn to imitation. We're absolutely drawn to pictures of ourselves in words. So whereas Plato saw poets as tempting us away from philosophy, Aristotle believed that poetry could get us closer to truth than either history or philosophy. Whereas Plato saw poetry as lies, Aristotle saw it as a deeper truth. And for instance, he said you could learn, if you're a statesman, you could learn a lot about being a good leader from reading the Iliad. Suppose you would learn the importance of keeping your best warrior happy, right? Or you could, don't take out your personal frustrations on people you depend on. So anyway, so the difference between Plato and Aristotle is one that shows up over and over again in our censorship battles. So I'm going to use an example because I know a number of you have read Catcher in the Rye. It's still a controversial book, believe it or not, in the United States. And so Plato, or the people who came after Plato, they would say perhaps, they would read Holden Caulfield, using bad language, disrespecting authority, running away from school, employing the services of a prostitute, and they would be afraid that, readers would go and do the same thing. Whereas Aristotle, and the followers of Aristotle would argue perhaps that by reading Catcher in the Rye, adolescents would gain new insight into themselves as they interact with Holden, finding a language and a narrative for their confusion, their fears, and their longings. So Platonists fear that such stories will ruin people for the world, whereas Aristotelians figure that such stories help people better negotiate the world. So another way of putting that is that Aristotle trusts audiences more than Plato does. Okay, so a lot of people who have come afterwards, probably more people agree with Aristotle than agree with Plato, at least theorists, probably because these people love literature and they want to believe that what literature does is good. Okay, so next person I'm looking at is Sir Philip Sidney. You heard of him? If you've ever heard of the concept of the Renaissance man, this was the Renaissance man, right? He was a courtier, he was a poet, he was a warrior, he was a lover. He's, you know, when people say the kind of perfect man, he was it. He died on the field of battle, you know. Queen Elizabeth first mourned his passing. So, at any rate, okay. So Sidney said that poetry helps us become more virtuous people. That's the purpose of poetry, he says. It inculcates virtue. So if you're going to put the word virtue up there, that's always a kind of good way to remember him. And then he said different poetic forms teach different virtues. So he said heroic poetry, like Homer or Aeneas. He said that would help us become better warriors. Although I guess he uses an example too of Aeneas, you know, carrying his father through the burning Troy, so that would, you know, teach you to become a better son. At any rate, he says, and so forth. And they said comedy and satire can make us ashamed of our faults, and through laughter and shame, they prod us to become better people. So, at any rate, so when the ultimate Renaissance man says that poetry helps us to become better people, it's hard to argue with him, okay? Now, when Aristotle, Sidney talk about literature making us better people, they mean making us into people who are like gentlemen and ladies, you know, like upper class people. Those are the people they're talking about. Percy Shelley, writing in a more revolutionary time, says poetry is all about freedom. He's a revolutionary. He's a supporter of the French Revolution. He came after the French Revolution, but okay, but you know, he was still a revolution, and revolution was in the air. So he says that great literature is in touch with the arc of history. I don't know if you know the expression, Obama used to use it, Martin Luther King used to use it. He said, the arc of history bends towards justice. You know that phrase, you know? He said, it takes a long time, thousands of years perhaps, but history is going in the right direction, bends towards justice. Okay, that's what Shelley thought, that's kind of what Marx thought too. Marx coming a little bit later. So Shelley believed that literature can help us break free of the forces that hold us back, and literature can help us grow into our true potential as human beings. This sounds like Marx, and Marx was influenced by Shelley, actually. And then the reason why poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world is because they grasp our essence as human beings. They see what we are capable of, and they fill us up with that vision. And even when, let me just say this: when Shelley saw literature playing a vital role in the liberation of, he saw the two most historical developments that he had seen as the liberation of women and the ending of slavery. And he thinks that poetry, by bestowing dignity on women and dignity on human beings, sowed the seeds for, more egalitarian societies. Right? So, just to give you an example, he says that the respect accorded to women in 12th century romances, like the Arthur, Chrétien de Troyes Arthurian stories, or the respect that Dante has for Beatrice in the Divine Comedy. Those are sowing the seeds that will ultimately lead to Mary Wollstonecraft's vindication of the arts of women, of the rights of women, and so forth. So if Sidney believed that literature makes us into more virtuous people, Percy Shelley believed that literature could help us become free. And by free, as I say, that means stepping into our potential, not holding back. Okay, Aristotle and his heirs didn't have the literary stage all to themselves, however. A number of theorists who came along who thought that literature could be bad for you. Here's an example of one of them. Not all literature, but Samuel Johnson. He wrote in the 18th century, sometimes called the last part of the century, is called the Age of Johnson. He thought that the book Tom Jones, which is my favorite novel, he thought the book Tom Jones would corrupt young people. He thought you read Tom Jones, and next thing you become a licentious rake, start sleeping around, and so on and so forth. So Johnson, you see, he's coming out of Plato, kind of that Plato line of thinking. So Johnson would not have liked Bertolt Brecht. I'm sure you all have heard of Bertolt Brecht, right? So Brecht is famous for saying, actually he didn't say this, it's often attributed to him, I think Trotsky actually said it, but he said that art should be not a mirror to reflect reality, but a hammer to change it, okay? So obviously I'm interested in Brecht because I want to know, can art change, can change reality? Can it change people? Brecht was in favor of literature that caused us to question class oppression, right? He was a communist, he was a fan of Marx, and he wanted us to kind of question class. So he would say that literature which causes us to question class oppression is good, and works that reinforce existing class society are reactionary. So then what about literature that makes us feel that blacks are inferior to whites, right? So that's what Chinua Achebe, if you know him, the great Nigerian novelist. So Chinua Achebe looked at Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, and he said that when we read that book, you come out of that book thinking that Africans are a howling mob. Right? So he was totally offended by that book, even though in some ways you can say that Joseph Conrad is attacking colonialism, which he is, but he's also comes up with a stereotypical depiction of Africans. And so what Achebe said is that these bad characterizations perpetuate racism. Okay? And another person who thought the same way, very much, is a great African-American thinker, W.E.B. Du Bois. All right, and then one more person who says that literature can be bad for us, potentially bad for us. Feminist Rachel Blau du Plessis. Let's see. So Rachel Blau. Okay, she's a feminist writing in the 20th. She's still alive. And she argues that women writers in the 19th century were trapped by the marriage plot. Okay, and so when you read even Pride and Prejudice or Jane Eyre, two books I love, she said she's critical even of those because she said those books make women think that their only option is marriage. And she wants women to write narratives that will get them to desire personal growth rather than marriage to a man. Okay? And she wants women following she would call, she wanted women to follow the quest plot, not the marriage plot. So for those of you who know Jane Eyre, for instance, a lot of Jane Eyre is quest plot, right? Because she's trying to find herself. I mean, it's a magnificent book, very, very influential. I'll be writing part of my upcoming book on Jane Eyre. But the last 2 pages, what does Jane say? She says, "Reader, I married him." And she says it with triumph, as though she has achieved the ultimate end. And Duplessis says that wipes out everything that has come before. So, anyway, so those are all people who point out that there are dimensions of literature that can be bad for you. Remember, contrast them with Sidney for a second, who said that all literature invokes virtue. Shelley says freedom, and then here are the people saying, well, no, these works are causing people to be less free. So what has happened here? So one thing is that these ancient writers believed that there was only one set of values, their own. Right? Aristotle was from a landowning society. Sir Philip Sidney was a courtier. And so if that's your view of things, then you assume that that's the way everybody should want to be. It's but once you start diversifying, once you have other people start entering into the conversation, once you have women and workers and young people, for that matter, and really more recently, members of the LGBTQ community, right? Once they start entering in, suddenly they are able to see things the way that, say, Chenoweth Achebe saw, Heart of Darkness, that mainstream scholars cannot see. So it's kind of like the more free you become, suddenly you start getting new perspectives into literature. So we see that Brecht, Duplessis, Achebe, W.E.B. Du Bois want literature to have a progressive agenda. Now, not all progressive activists demand that literature follow a progressive agenda. Marx is interesting. Marx actually said he learned more about economics from Honoré de Balzac, who was a monarchist sympathizer, right? Balzac, he said he learned more from Balzac about capitalism than he learned from any economist. And so what Marx said, so it's interesting, so Marx didn't want, and Engels is the same way. Engels said, I don't want authors to write propaganda. I want authors to write the truth. Now, if you think that the truth is bending towards justice, you can see why Marx could want them to talk about truth. But at any rate, that's... so they said, well, you authors, you go do your thing. You capture the shades of futurity, the shadow of futurity, as Shelley called it, and then we'll come along and we'll take the insights you gain and use them to, for effective political action. Okay. So, all right, so far I've been talking mostly about liberals and radicals. So I don't know what your politics are, but I am going to talk briefly about conservatives now. So here's one kind of liberal for his day, but kind of certainly seen as a conservative now, and that's Matthew Arnold. He was British, a British poet and critic, Victorian times. He believed that literature civilized us. Any of you ever come across that idea? Literature civilizes us, all right? We are in danger of being overwhelmed, he said, by cultural barbarians. We are in danger of being overwhelmed by what he called Philistines. These are people who don't read, who don't write, who are ignorant. And so he believed that literature was like, it kept the barbarian from entering the gates. That was a vision he had. The barbarians, for Matthew Arnold, were the working class. And he thought that the working class would come in and they would destroy everything and turn, 1984 or something. So, Stalin is hell. Oh, he was before Stalin, okay. So what he thought was that, okay, what you should do, because literature, he saw literature so powerful, he said, you should teach the workers literature. Because if you teach the workers literature, they won't be barbarian anymore, and then they will stay in their place and not cause any trouble. There's Terry Eagleton, who I think was in Slovenia recently. Is that true? Okay, yeah. Terry Eagleton, who I love, is very funny. Right? He said, Matthew Arnold's philosophy was, if you throw the working class some books, they won't throw up barricades. Okay, but you see, that's kind of conservative use of literature. Not literature to promote freedom, but literature to keep social order. All right. So there's a whole line of conservative educators who quote Matthew Arnold in my country all the time. When America was going through the so-called culture wars during the 1980s and the 1990s, well, we're still going through culture wars, but we were really, about English departments were going through culture wars in the 1880s and 1890s. Some conservatives chanted, let's see, it was Jane Austen, not Alice Walker. Okay, Jane Austen, not Alice Walker. Okay, what does that mean? Alice Walker's a radical black feminist. Jane Austen was a very safe and somewhat conservative author. So they said, if you teach, they said, English departments are radicalizing our student body with this multiculturalism and postmodernism, and we're all going astray, and we have to get back to the revered classics. And if we do that, then I guess students will settle down. But notice what the common denominator in all of these thinkers, Plato, Aristotle, Sidney, Johnson, Matthew Arnold, and all of it, is that they all believe that literature changes lives. Now, some believe that literature changes lives for the better, some for the worse, and kind of so on and so forth. But they do think that literature makes a difference. So people have been talking about this way for a long time. Now, many of my students at St. Mary's go on to become English teachers. Maybe some of you are going to become English teachers. And they hope, they're idealistic. I love my students, and they're very idealistic, and they hope that by teaching their students literature, they can make them better people. And so I've kind of looked at this, and I can see kind of a conservative strain, a liberal strain, and a radical strain. There's only like 3 different kinds of teachers. You can check which kind of teachers you have had, what kind of teachers you have here at the Filozofska, right? So conservatives, like Matthew Arnold, use literature to affirm traditional values and to uphold the way things are. I suspect that teachers in the Matthew Arnold strain probably don't teach a lot of Brecht, I would imagine, in their class. So they're more likely to teach Jane Austen. Jane Austen is nice and safe. I think actually Jane Austen, I think she's a secret radical, but that's a lecture for a different day. But I had to fight against the stream to make that argument, so okay. Then there are liberals. So let's say he's conservative. You have the conservative Matthew Arnold. Then you have liberals, and 2 of the liberals are there's what I really love her. She's a very humane philosopher at the University of Chicago. Her name is Martha Nussbaum. She's one of my, these. I guess this tags me for a liberal because my 2 favorite theorists here are Martha Nussbaum and Wayne Booth. And both of these are, actually they both teach or taught at the University of Chicago. And they say that we teach literature to instill humanist values and to foster responsible citizens. Martha Nussbaum actually has a wonderful essay about how you read literature to teach students how to become better voters. If the responsibilities of a citizen is to understand different people. And she said, look at it. Okay, you take a work like, she looks at, let's see, in that essay, she looks at Sophocles' play Philoctetes and Ralph Ellison's The Invisible Man. And she says in both of them, these are plays that force you to get out of your own perspective and into somebody else's shoes. You know, you have to understand what it's like for an invisible man to be an African-American man, you know, in the city. And so, and literature, just think how well literature does that. So she says, if you can be that kind of a voter, then you'll be able to empathize with other people, understand why they think the way they do, but also come to your own strong. So that you say that's the liberals, and then you'd say the radicals, some of whom we've seen so far. They would look at, you know, Brecht for sure. Shelley, I probably put Shelley there as well. Right, and these are people who want to change the system altogether, not make you better participants in that system, but just to change the system, right? So they see literature. So what they do is that literature's purpose is to fight against inequality and fight in favor of social justice. So, and all committed teachers see their mission as changing their students, but the question is, how far do you let them change, into what direction? I suspect, I love Shelley. Shelley might be my favorite person I'm talking about today, but I really like these two as well, so I'm kind of, I can see a point to, I'm open to Matthew Arnold, but parts of it, I lean more down here. Now, of course, there are people who see literature as irrelevant to their lives. Maybe you are related to some of them who can't understand why people are having these big fights about things that they never even look at. How can you? And on the other hand, I've been talking to some of your teachers here about the how do you pronounce it? Yuri Bezlai. Affair, and perhaps some of you are kind of following this, where somebody writes a novel, and suddenly at least part of Slovenia is up in arms, and there are angry letters and angry editorials going back and forth, and so on and forth. So somehow he has, he's galvanized something, right? I haven't read his work, so I can't speak for myself. I've heard descriptions against it. So that's an example of how literature continues to stir things up. So on the one hand, it's very unfortunate that this certainly if man would kind of get attacked in this way. On the other hand, you have to say, well, at least people still care about literature. They care about it enough. Sometimes I feel like conservatives care more about literature than liberals do, because liberals say, "Oh yeah, read literature. It's kind of good for you." Or liberals say, conservatives feel like it'll change your life in bad ways. In fact, I'll give you an example. This always baffles me, but of course, in America, as in Slovenia, I know Harry Potter was a big, has been, perhaps still is, a big success. So I was teaching a course, actually, of course, looking at all these thinkers. This is my theories of the reader, I call it, and I asked how many students in my class did your parents not allow you to read Harry Potter when you were growing up? And a third of the class said that was the case. Their parents were very religious. They thought that Harry Potter would lead them into, the devil's ways or something like that. But so he said, well, that's unfortunate. At the very least, however, they took J.K. Rowling very seriously. They felt that J.K. Rowling could change lives. So sometimes it's sometimes the right takes literature more seriously than the left does, I have a feeling. All right, so let me kind of one last thing on this, my kind of quick survey of the thinkers. I remember hearing, you tell me this, is the phrase, you have great literature, and then you have trivialna literatura.
Yes.
Is that right? Trivialna literatura? Okay. Which I assume means trivial literature. Not exact. So, okay. So what are we to make of trivial literature? We've been talking about great literature. Shelley says great literature, has its pulse on history and shows us the future. What about trivial literature? So there are certain people who think that trivial literature is bad for you. Perhaps some of you think that as well. the people who really talked about this the most were the Frankfurt School. This was the 1920s, 1930s, until they all had to leave Germany because of Hitler. Frankfurt School with figures like Theodor Adorno and Herbert Marcuse. Those two of the ones who talked about popular literature or trivialna literatura the most. Okay? And so while they believed like Shelley and Marx, that great literature takes us to freedom, they said that trivialna literatura is the opiate of the masses. It distracts us from what we should be doing. So you read, I don't know, you read a spy novel instead of going to a union meeting, you know, or something like that. Or by the way, a number of feminists have made the same argument about romance literature. So they're afraid that you read these books and then you'll have to go out and find Mr. Right, as opposed to developing yourself. You know, they're afraid so there's some feminist theorists who believe that trivialna literatura inculcates people into at least passive. You become passive, if not actually reactionary. By the way, not all women scholars think this way. There are women scholars who actually have done close analysis of some pretty awful literature. But they say, if you look really closely, you'll see that even in these, we call them Harlequin romances. I don't know if you know that phrase, but anyway, really kind of cheap things they say. Even in those, you'll see there's a struggle for female dignity. There's a struggle for female agency, and so don't dismiss them quite as fast as you're doing. So figure that out. All right. So that's a very short, quick summation of the conversation that has gone on throughout the ages. And if you have further questions, we can talk about that at the end. But I want to move now from this kind of public conversation that's gone on about literature, how literature changes lives, to more private. And this is, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I do in my classes, which is, I have my students write, I call this a reading history. And the purpose of this assignment is for students to figure out how they have used literature in their own lives to negotiate their challenges. Usually students aren't aware, sometimes they are, but usually they're not aware of how deeply they have used literature to confront some of the most, the biggest things that they face. And I'm going to start with an example of my own, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about this assignment, and then I want you to start thinking about, you might even start thinking about that now, saying, what works, What works have I really liked, and I have two parts to it. What works have I really liked, and what works have I really hated? Because you can also often learn about yourself from works that you've hated, as well as works that you've liked. The hard works to figure anything out about are works which you just you shrug, you're indifferent, because if you're indifferent, nothing, it just washed over you, right? So, here's a story. When I was 11 years old, I told this to a class the other day, but when I was 11 years old, I was in the middle of the civil rights movement. We were fighting over, my parents were liberals, they were fighting for civil rights. I was called, and so I got bullied because they knew who I was, and I got called, the phrase was I can't even use the word because it's so ugly to me, but I was called an N-lover. N-word lover was a phrase that got thrown around at the time. And I'm like 11 years old. You know how confusing a time being 11 years old is. Okay, but my father read me and my brother's Huckleberry Finn, which I fell in love with. And the scene I loved, and it's the most famous scene in the book, right, is where he says, okay, he goes and he's going to rescue Jim. So, okay, I'll go to hell, he says, right? I will go rescue my friend Jim, even though everything around him says, if you're a good person, you should turn him in. So it's the personal conscience going up against the social values of the time. So I really liked it. I didn't think that much about it. I was 11 years old. I didn't do literary theory at 11. But what I realized looking back, what that book, what that scene helped me do, was when I would be, bullied, I would say, it doesn't matter what they're saying, because in here, I know that there's another, another truth. And so it gave me that, so I was given a very vivid, Huckleberry Huck Finn is a very fully realized character, and it's like there's somebody in the world, or something had been imagined that I could put myself in place of, and it gave me a way of standing up to the bullies. Well, I didn't stand up to them because I was very small, but at least mentally, it gave me a place to stand. I just mentioned the other big book for me at that time, during all of that, was To Kill a Mockingbird. Once again, I totally identified with Scout in that particular. You don't have to, you can identify with girls as well as boys. Identification goes both ways. All right, so here's the assignment. So I say, first of all, choose 3 works. I say, so you might want to do this on your own. This is kind of fun. Choose 3 works, and I often say the first work can be the earliest work you remember reading. So if you had your parents read you a book over and over again, any of you have that? Cat in the Hat by Dr. Seuss. That was a book that I read over. I had my parents read to me over and over again. That was, and then maybe a book that you in primary school, and then a book in gymnasia, say, or in college. Anyway, have space between those 3, and then this is your job. The job is to, first of all, describe in as much detail as you can the experience that you had with that book. I say, remember scenes, remember where you were sitting, did your parents read it to you, did you read it on the bus, did you read it on your own, was it assigned to you in class, everything you can remember about it. Don't go back to the book though, because sometimes you misremember, and your misrememberings are very revealing as well. So you've got to kind of write that, and then the job is, you have to figure out who you were at that time, which explains why you had the reaction that you did. Follow that? Who were you at the time you read the book that explains why you had the reaction that you had? It's kind of fun. Sometimes my students will call up their parents and say, what was going on? They actually reconstruct, childhood. So it's a fun assignment. And then, and this is I sometimes say one last thing. Sometimes say, and figure out how all 3 books are the same book. Because sometimes you can do that, sometimes you can't. Because sometimes what you discover is, and this is yet another theorist, a man named Norman Holland. He's a Freudian, and what he calls an identity theme. And Holland says that when we read, he says we replicate our identity theme. So we are a certain kind of person deep down in here, and when we read the books through the lens of who we are. It's not a bad thing or a good thing. It's like we can't do anything else. And he's got all kinds of examples of, he'll look at like how 5 different students read Hamlet, and then he'll actually do psychological studies of them, and he fill out forms, and then he says, okay, this person has this kind of issue, this person has this kind of issue, and that's why this person's focusing on, he's a Freudian, as they say. That's why this person has this response, and this person has this response. I don't go that detailed into, I let my students discover this rather than by doing it for them. So, but at any rate, that's the assignment. And, okay, I've been teaching for 37 years now. I guess even more if you count my graduate student teaching. And I can tell you, so I've seen it, that any work of literature that has elicited a strong reaction from you, you have used in some critical way in your life journey. You have used it to help you become independent from your parents, or to handle a bully, or work through a difficult relationship, or help you enter a new environment, or deal with a tragedy in your family, and you don't know what it is ahead of time, and when you're reading it, you don't know that that's necessarily what it's done. But what this assignment does is it allows you to go back to that experience and say, aha, okay, this is why I responded as I responded. So and sorry I can't pronounce that author who's under attack right now. Who's that against Steak Yuri? Yeah. That's hard. Depends how much Slovene.
It's Czech.
That's Czech, okay, that's all right.
Mother was Czech.
Okay, all right, that's not out of my. From just listening to what people have been saying, is that you probably can tell more, the people who are attacking it, especially this journalist of today, you probably can tell more about her from her response than you can about anything about the book itself. Right? She's going into it with who knows what agenda. I mean, if it hits it that hard, then there's something profound going on. So using that kind of reader response, analyzing that kind of response, will give you kind of special insight into the controversy. Not only her as a person, but if she's representing some kind of larger trend in Slovenian society, then you can say, okay, this is why people are responding this way, because this author has touched the nerve, and this gives us a window into that nerve. All right. I'm going to give you one more. We'll leave plenty of time to try some of these ideas out, so you can try them out as well. Here's a story that caught me totally by surprise. And by the way, when I give this assignment, I never know how students are going to respond. My students always surprise me. They just go, and the use they have made of literature is, I'm always just basically astounded. I certainly was with this. So I had a few years ago, I had in class a man who had been fought in the war in Afghanistan, an ugly, ugly war, right? And he'd been a Marine, and his job had been disassembling those roadside bombs. So really dangerous job. And we were talking about Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. You're kind of a medieval romance. So what would a Marine fighting in Afghanistan see in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight? So if you don't know the poem, I won't go into it in detail, but there's a beheading contest where the Green Knight rides in Arthur's court and says, "You behead me, and then I get to behead you." Gawain comes up, he beheads the Green Knight, and the Green Knight picks up his head and says, "I'll meet you in a year's time." At the Green Chapel, wherever that is. And, okay, so basically, which means that Gawain knows that he has 1 year left to live. It's almost like a cancer diagnosis, because, he knows he's not going to survive the return blow. Okay, so that's the story. But how does Gawain handle this? He just shrugs. One translation he says, "Good men can but try." Shrug, right? And so Max was his name, and he said, "This is how my Marine buddies and I were. We just shrugged off death." So okay, so that he kind of made that comment. So I said, maybe. But what he learned as he started looking at that poem more closely, as he started looking at his reactions to the poem, he realized that Gawain does not shrug off death that easily after all. Shrugging, in fact, was just a protective mechanism he used to hide his fear. It's just how you know, he's a Camelot knight. He's not supposed to be afraid, so he pretends not to be afraid. That doesn't mean he's really afraid. It means he's pushed it down there. But and the reason you know he's afraid is when this lady, he goes off into the woods, and there's this magical castle, and this lady comes up to him, and she's trying to seduce him, but he won't be seduced. But finally she says, take this green girdle, or take this green belt, and it will save your life. And he takes it, and he hides it from his host, and he's a little underhanded about it. And he's the perfect knight, right? So, but he's not acting in a perfect way right then. And then he shows up. I'll have to ruin this for you a little bit. He shows up to get the return blow, and the knight says, first of all, he doesn't cut off his head. He just gives him a little nick there, and then he says, I know you're wearing this green girdle, and that I'm actually the lord of the castle, and there's the whole thing about that. And Gawain is absolutely, he's ashamed. His face turns bright red. He's kind of ashamed because why? Because he cared for his life. Okay? But the Green Knight says, big deal. You cared for your life. Good for you. Right? So, and you kind of, one way to read that poem is the Green Knight is your human nature. And your human nature feels like I've been disregarded. I've been dissed, my students say. I've been disrespected. I've been disrespected, and I'm not going to let you go until you admit that you care for your life. And you just did, because you took that belt. And I think he also, Gawain also flinches when the axe starts coming down. Who wouldn't flinch, but okay? But you wouldn't flinch if you don't care, right? So he's got Gawain to admit that he cared for his life. So back to Max. He said, oh my goodness. He said one thing he would do when he would go out to disassemble these bombs, he would put on Kevlar armor, body armor. He said it wouldn't have done any good at all. Yeah, the bomb blows up, you're dead. He said that armor was like the sash. That armor showed to me that I wasn't shrugging off death the way that I thought I was. It's like is reading this 14th century poem opened him up to feelings he didn't know that he had. And once he heard that, he started reliving the Afghanistan experience, and he turned the whole thing into a healing process. And he was a wonderful person. We gave him the English Award at the end of his senior year. It was a very, very inspiring story. So I take my students' responses to literature really, really seriously, because I know that there's always something at stake in the reading process. There's something at stake in the works that we like, and there's something at stake in the works that we hate. Sometimes liking and hating are just two sides of the same coin. I hated, by the way, I hated Catcher in the Rye. When I wanted to read Lord of the Rings. I didn't read it. Catcher in the Rye. Catcher in the Rye was, I said I wanted to read Catcher in the Rye because I didn't want to grow up, basically. Because growing up was like, just wanted to stay in fantasy world. Then I went back years later and reread Catcher in the Rye and said, oh my God, Holden Caulfield doesn't want to grow up. Right? He wants to catch Phoebe and these little kids before they go off into adulthood. I said, the reason I hated that book is because it was making me, I now think, it was making me aware of what I was so upset with at the time. I didn't want to be aware of it. Now I think it's a phenomenal novel. I think it's a phenomenal novel. So the works you like, the works you hate, they will open up windows into you. So just to kind of bring this kind of lecture around full circle, so look what we did. We started off with Plato complaining about young men reading Homer, listening to Homer. We had people come along and say, I love literature, and so it must be good. And then you had people come along and say, well, some literature might be good, but some literature maybe not, and then a debate about trivialna literatura, and so on and so forth. But everybody, and English teachers who see themselves going into the schools and giving their kids literature so that they can grow up to be different kinds of people, depending on what the vision of that teacher is. And then I have a lot of teachers who do this assignment, and it's really good for them because what they realize is that if they've done this exercise on themselves, they can, you can't ask, an 11-year-old, 12-year-old, even a 14-year-old probably couldn't do this kind of assignment because they can't get outside them, you're still inside the experience. But a teacher can use that as a window into where the student is. So the student says, in two ways. One, if the student says, I really like this book, the teacher's mind can start churning and say, yeah, that makes sense that so-and-so would like this book because I see them wrestling with these kinds of issues. Or the other way around is you see a child wrestling with certain kinds of issues and you can predict that this is the kind of book that would probably open up worlds for that child. And in the end, literature, this is what literature does. Literature knows you better than you know yourself. Right? At least the literature that you fall in love with, it knows you better than you know yourself. But if you want to know yourself a little bit better, know thyself, Socrates, right? This is a very powerful tool that you can use to do that. So I thought I would ask. So I saw Jason do this the other day, so I feel okay. If I could kind of pair you up, or kind of make pairs or threes to make sure. If you could just share a work, let's say a work of literature, so poetry, drama, or fiction, long or short, that you that hit you hard somewhere along the line, and describe what your experience was with that work. You don't have to do a self-psychoanalysis. I'm not asking for that. Okay. But at any rate, just so you get a sense of literature entering into lives in a powerful way. So just take about 3 or 4 minutes to do it. So what I'm going to do here, you don't have to share your story or anything like that. But either if you want to talk about a book that that kind of is on your mind and what came up, or let's make this broader than just the books you just talked about. If there's another book that you've heard about and you want to know, and if I've heard about it, I'll kind of help you out with that. But books that have caused controversy. If you've heard stories of Harry Potter getting burned, or Judy Blume books being banned, or anything like that, feel free to bring those up. I have a second assignment that I give. There are 2 writing assignments in this particular. Plus, I make them read all these works. It's a very, very challenging course. But is to take a work that caused a stir, I say, or that caused commotion, and then they have to do a historical research. And they find out I had a great essay. Some student discovered that The Wizard of Oz had been banned from a Tennessee school in 1985. The Wizard of Oz. And she went back, and then she suddenly realized that there's this whole thing it was all about female empowerment and good witches. And Dorothy is, in the book, unlike the movie, she's really a strong character. And so it had to do with witches and something like that. So there's all kinds of things. So I'm interested in hearing books that you'd like to talk about, either ones you've just talked about right now, or other books that have come up in your experience. Don't be shy. Glad. Okay.
Could you repeat again, because things are part of...
I hear, sorry. I just want to hear either a book that you just talked about, so just tell me one of the books you just talked about, if you're willing to do that, or you can bring up any other book. any work of literature that you've heard that there's a controversy about. So either the book you just talked about, and we'll talk about it without getting personal, or a book that, okay, sure.
Animal Farm just got banned in China. Or did I?
Ah, okay. Right.
Because of the whole controversy.
What, just now it got banned?
Not just like now, but a week or two ago. The person that established his own mandate.
Okay, no, I'm surprised it wasn't banned.
Oh, that's what you meant.
Yeah.
Or like, I know it keeps coming up in the like lists of banned books from like prisons or schools.
Ah, okay. Animal Farm, you've heard it's become banned in prisons as well?
Or I mix it up.
I mean, I certainly understand China because I mean it's an allegory for Stalinism among other things, right? So yeah, you could see why authorities they're supposed to be a people's republic.
I'll check it out.
Okay, I'm interested. You're supposed to be a people's republic, and if some pigs are more equal than others, that's a real critique. So yeah, yeah, that one says. I guess I see why Professor Schwartz just said it's only now been banned.
Yeah, it says
you think it would never have been allowed in?
They banned Animal Farm and letter M.
What's the other one?
Letter M.
Okay, that one I don't know. So good, yeah. So these are books that cause a commotion. Books that are banned, are often a kind of a nice way to start. So I'm going to call on you if you don't volunteer. So
you've got the satanic verses.
Satanic verses, oh my God, right? Yeah. In some ways, the satanic verses. I assume that most people who are out to kill Rushdie did not read it, right? So.
I mean, I haven't read it myself, so I can't comment on that.
Yeah, it's the only problem with works like Animal Farm and Satanic Verses is it's so obvious. I always like the ones where, something's been banned, like Wizard of Oz, and you say, it doesn't make any sense. And then you dig down, because when you dig down, then you see it's operating on levels that you didn't realize. Yeah, I mean, just by making, Muhammad a character in the...
It's pretty low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, right. So if there's a work, and feel free to choose a Slovenian work if that's it, and then of course I'll be out of. Other than Samo Razniki, I haven't read any Slovenian novels, but oh boy, that one took the top of my head off.
See, it's not so much that they were banned; they just never got published.
All right.
So there's a difference there.
So, because then.
Yeah, but if they did get banned, it was for a different reason, because a lot of this literature was published in Austro-Hungarian times, and then it was more of a censorship because of national interest, because they didn't want.
So you have a Samo Razniki?
I'm not sure about that.
Okay.
Exactly,
No.
but like a lot of our famous literature, for instance, is from this general period.
Or they made it. It's more that it was censored in terms of changes being made, and it was all sort of political.
Yeah, sometimes, as I say, as you said, low-hanging fruit. Sometimes it's just obvious. Of course, that works that way, and then others says. But I mean, the fun part of this assignment for me is finding works that surprise. Whoa. Yeah. And here's an example. I'll give one of my favorite reviews of all time. Is a totally negative, slashing review about a book that I love. Is a reviewer in 1847 reviewed Jane Eyre, and she said basically. This book is communist. This book, or Chartist from communism. This book is anti-Christian, and this book is unladylike, unfeminine. And she said, if a woman wrote this book, she is no lady. And I said, okay. So I love it, and what you realize when I start digging is that Jane Eyre is such a powerful assertion of female power that another woman recognized that. And it's almost like, and this other woman was a professional herself, and it's almost like she was saying, she's about to blow our cover. Whereas when men read the book, men loved the if you know Helen Burns. Helen Burns occupies like 2 chapters, right? But Helen Burns is kind of a sweet, innocent child, and men could handle women when they were sweet, innocent angels. And then the same people who liked Helen Burns, they didn't really like the Bertha Mason, the Man, Woman in the Attic. That was a little bit too melodramatic for them. And I'm talking about some really good reviewers like Henry Lewis, who was George Eliot's companion. And so men, when they read it one sort of way, and they liked it, but they kind of moved around these strong assertions of female power. Whereas a woman reading at the time said, as they say, yeah, just type in Rigby, Elizabeth, Jane Eyre, because it's like, things at top of your head off. Now, to show how Rigby was onto something, you could look at the work when it first came out, which they did in this case, but also look at the work through time. So Jane Eyre was the book that governesses were really sexual abuse, assault, horrible working conditions. So they unionized. So it's, in the 19th century, governesses unionized. This, Jane Eyre, was their book. Jane Eyre was the book of the suffragette movement. So, and you can bet they didn't go to the ending and said, "Reader, I married him." What they did was, this is a woman who walks away from Rochester, who said, what's the great line? I'm sure a lot of people kind of open face their fist and say, "Who cares for you? I care for myself." Right? So suffragette movement, and then look at how it keeps on going. It gets rewritten by Jean Rhys in the Caribbean, and suddenly it becomes one of the wide Sargasso Sea, and it becomes like a key work in the kind of post-colonial movement. And suddenly Bertha Mason has been turned into like the heroine, the Man, Woman in the Attic. And then Jane Eyre was the book for the 1970s feminism. The Mad Woman in the Attic became almost like the defining trope of 1970s feminism. So it's like people kept on coming back to this book over and over again. So just a novel. Just, who takes a novel seriously, right? Except that it entered into people's identity dramas in ways that you can say, had a real historical impact. Do you have a thought?
Oh, no.
Oh, okay, I thought.
I was searching for books that were banned, and I was surprised to find Ulysses.
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah.
Banned
in
no one
Boston,
could
right?
understand it.
Some of that is just this, it's very erotic in parts, right?
Yeah.
Although you have to, pretty good readers to figure that out. Wade through a lot of words to get to the dirty stuff, so. But it's in there, yeah. Leopold Bloom's What do he and Stephen do that night on the town? So, but that's a good way to look at this. What books have been banned, and then why?
50 Shades of Grey.
What's the word?
50 Shades of Grey.
50 Shades of Grey. Yeah, that's kind of low-hanging fruit too, right? Although I don't know. I mean, I think the more interesting response to 50 Shades of Grey is why it didn't cause more of a commotion. It seems that at least in the United States.
It's so badly written.
Well, that has nothing to do with it. Well, maybe it does. But it's almost like so mild. I would have expected more of a cure.
But I think people saw it as just so trivial they didn't want to be associated with it, even on the level of randomness.
Yeah.
But I think that people have that it will die down, because if a lot of people would cause a lot of commotion about it being bad literature and actually convey information that is very, very wrong.
Right.
They hope that if they stay quiet and don't touch it don't poke it with a stick, it will die down and nobody will ever
Oh, okay. So see, that's such a hard response to monitor, because when people don't say anything, then you're interpreting silences. It's a lot easier to interpret a really angry review. That's why I love angry reviews. I'm so fascinated with the controversy you're going through right now.
Actually, the most vocal response was from the BDSM community, who were upset about the misrepresentation of their practices.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, in some ways, I'm less interested in this if it's badly written or poorly written as what identity themes it's setting off. Because I think one thing that'll happen with a lot of, sometimes literally, not only looks like 50 Shades of Grey, but sometimes literature will venture into very dangerous territory. And of course, Oedipus would be the most famous example. But and Freud talked about this, but it'll find ways to not sugarcoat it exactly, but kind of buy off the censor. So maybe because it's a work of art, you're allowed to kind of look at it a little bit further and so forth like that. Whereas if you faced what it is that you fear directly, you would throw the book out the window, or you couldn't even pick it up. So, yeah, it's interesting because it's not like I have this kind of automatic machine to put it through and it's okay, this kind of book and these kind of results come out. It really is like any act of literary interpretation. You're kind of saying who's the author, who's the reader, what kind of what few reviews do I have here, what can I reassemble about the society this is. And once I've looked at all of that, how do I think that this work is impacting the lives of readers or listeners or playgoers, so forth.
Maybe an interesting example would be Gulliver's Travels, because it was controversial when it came out, and now we've kind of denoted it to children's book.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Oh, that's right. So he's kind of buying off the censors, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then here's something else. Here's something else you can do. That. So when Gulliver's Travels came out, even Swift had to pull certain things out because they were too hot. I mean, he was, and then they kind of went into a later situation. But yeah, so satirists. And the interesting thing about satirists is because satirists, I mean, you don't have to read way between the lines. They're often allegories. I think it was George the Crown Prince at the time. He would become George II later. He's got you have the high heel party and the low heel party, and the high heels are the Tories, and the low heels are the Whigs, and so the Crown Prince wears one high heel and one low heel, and goes tottering around like that. So everybody read it, and they knew there was the Crown Prince. Although supposedly his wife laughed at that scene. But you're right. So if it had been a direct political tract attacking the monarchy and attacking Robert Walpole, who's the prime minister at that time, yeah, it would have been censored. So he was able to use this children's story to get under the official censors. So that's a great example. Any other ones?
The Sorrows of Young Werther.
That's
Back by the Pope because of the ending, of course, and then he bought as many editions as he could find just to burn them. But that made people want to buy them even more.
Yeah. I know something about the response to this because I've actually had 2 students over the years who've written about the response because that was a suicide book, right? I mean, it's like, and there were these stories about suicide epidemic. I think it's even called Werther syndrome. I think something like that. So I had a German student actually did a deep dive into what exactly happened with the publication of and what she discovered was that parents were really threatened by that book. Parents hated that book. Young people loved it. So first of all, it's a kind of generational. She also discovered that not that many people committed suicide. I think one person was found drowned with a copy, and I think there were like 2 documented cases, a lot fewer than they thought. And of course, Werther, I mean, it's not exactly Dorsey. He's not exactly the most positive character, right? But the big thing it did was that German parents didn't want their children expressing their feelings. And that's, I mean, it's just outpouring feeling, right? Literature is so emotional, and that threatened to throw off the way that they constituted reality. And then because it threw off their way of constituted reality, that's exactly why young people loved it. Because first of all, it pissed their parents off, but also it was a harbinger of romanticism, right? And feelings were all the rage. The age of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and everything like that. So, yeah. So what I think is so interesting about the response to Stories of Young Werther is the generational divide. Parents hated it, young people loved it.
Knut Hamsun, everything by Knut Hamsun.
Oh, who's that?
Knut Hamsun, the Norwegian author. I don't know how to say it in American.
Thompson?
Hamsun.
Oh.
Norwegian author, the one that-
Right. I've never read it. I've read, so you tell me what you think. Why? I mean, he's the one who writes those kind of really long, like confessional novels. Is that? I mean, like personal novels. Am I right?
No.
Okay, all right.
Probably makes Knausgård, yeah.
There's some Norwegians.
Volumes, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, go back to your and so what kind of reader response has there been to him?
He was loved in Norway.
Mm-hmm.
He was loved in Norway, yeah. But then he pledged allegiance to Hitler, and they massively sent his books back to him.
All right. Ah.
So it was in reverse. He wasn't controversial at first. He
Right.
became controversial, and everyone just denied his books. And then there was some retroactive reading of him that claimed that he was a Nazi from the beginning, but they just didn't spot it.
That's so interesting. Okay.
Yeah, and he got the Nobel Prize before he pledged allegiance to Hitler. So yeah.
Oh, that guy. Okay. All right. I didn't realize I had heard something. Is he the one who did Barabbas?
Sorry.
Okay. Never. Anyway. Okay. But what you can do with that? Yeah. So then, it's so interesting. So people have one response, and then they hear about something, and then they have a different response, and so that's. As a reader response scholar, I love stories like that because then you do a comparison contrast. And what does it say that they loved it? They loved it here and then didn't. Yeah, I'll give you another example. One person that was really popular with Nazi youth was Hermann Hesse, who then became I was a hippie in the 60s and 70s. Hermann Hesse, everybody was carrying around copies of Siddhartha, right? So then he said, oh, okay, so Nazi youth liked it, and anti-war protesters liked it, and what does that mean? Yeah, and does that mean we had fascistic elements? Is that just a kind of comment on youth? And there's no one answer, but you can see the fascinating conversations that looking at books in this particular way open up. Well, I think that's probably enough for you. You've had a long day, but thank you very much. But try this exercise. Think about it. If you're going to carry around with it, then if you see me in the halls, come up to me and tell me, what about this work? And I'll share that with you.